Welcome back to my inner sanctum. I'm your hostess, Countess Elizabeth, mistress of the macabre. Strangers are people you don't know and therefore don't trust. Would you trust a stranger with your life? Well, that's exactly what we do when we get on an airplane. We establish trust with the captain and crew that they will, in their best efforts, attempt to get us to our destination safely. Sometimes, though, this trust is misplaced and broken. Today, my fiends, we will look at a situation that involved this trust being broken when one of the crew took control of the plane and intentionally crashed into the ocean. So, let us finish our complimentary snacks and brace for impact so we can explore our grotesque curiosity. EgyptAir Flight 990 was a regularly scheduled flight from Los Angeles International Airport to Cairo International Airport, with a stop at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City. On October 31st, 1999, the Boeing 767 operating the route crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, about 60 miles or 100 kilometers south of Nantucket Island, Massachusetts, killing all 217 passengers and crew on board. It was later found that the cause of this crash was not any sort of airplane malfunction, but was caused by the intentional actions of 59-year-old Relief First Officer Gamil al-Batouti. Gamil took control of the airplane to relieve the initial pilots, but as soon as he had the opportunity, he disengaged the autopilot, turned off the engines, and steered the plane into the ocean as an act of revenge. October 31st, 1999, 1:20 a.m., Flight 990 took off from JFK and proceeded eastward over the Atlantic Ocean. Flight 990's cockpit crew consisted of 57-year-old Captain Ahmed El-Habashi, 36-year-old First Officer Adel Anwar, 52-year-old Relief Captain Rauf Noreldin, 59-year-old Relief First Officer Gamil Al-Batouti, and the airline's chief pilot for the Boeing 767, Captain Hatem Rushdie. The relief crew members were supposed to take over the controls at the flight's halfway point. Of the 217 people on board, 100 were from the United States. 89 were from Egypt, including the crew. 21 were Canadian, and the remaining 7 hailed from 4 additional countries. Among the Egyptian passengers were 33 Air Force officers returning from training in the U.S., including 2 brigadier generals and a colonel. All of the pilots had plenty of experience. Captain Habashi had been flying for Air Egypt since 1963, and Relief First Officer Batouti was just 3 months from retirement. All was normal for the first 20 minutes of the flight. Habashi and Anwar were initially at the controls. Then, at 1:40 a.m., Relief First Officer Batouti entered the cockpit, and this dialogue took place. "Just wait, let me tell you something," Batouti said to Anwar. "I'm not going to sleep at all. I might come and sit for 2 hours." Batouti was not supposed to take over until halfway through the flight. Anwar was reluctant. "But I slept, Anwar protested. "You mean you're not going to get up?" said Batouti. "You'll get up. Go and get some rest and come back." "You should have told me this, Captain Camille," said Anwar. Although Batouti was the first officer, many of his fellow pilots called him Captain because, in his previous capacity as a training captain out of the Egyptian Air Force, he had previously instructed them. "Did I even see you?" said Batouti. Anwar continued to protest, asking Captain Camille to go back to sleep before taking over. But eventually, Anwar gave in, allowing Batouti to get his dinner and then returned to take over flying duty. While Batouti was out of the cockpit, Anwar complained to Captain Habashi, "See how he does whatever he pleases?" Shortly thereafter, Relief First Officer Batouti returned to the cockpit, and First Officer Anwar gave up his seat. It was 1:42 a.m. For the next several minutes, Habashi and Batouti conversed normally. Then, at 1:48, Habashi announced that he was going to use the toilet before it got crowded, leaving Batouti alone at the controls. Batouti said something unintelligible to himself, then softly added the phrase, "Tawakkutu al-Allah," which is an Arabic phrase that translates to, "I rely on God." Some 30 seconds later, Batouti disengaged the autopilot, taking manual control of the plane. For several seconds more, he did nothing. Then he again whispered, "I rely on God," rolled back the engine power to idle, and abruptly pitched the plane to 40 degrees nose down. With terrifying rapidity, the 767 began its descent towards the sea. Captain Habashi immediately aborted his trip to the toilet and managed to claw his way back towards the cockpit, despite near-zero gravity conditions. Inside, Batouti had the control column forward, repeating, I rely on God. I rely on God, over and over again, but he had not locked the door. As this was before the implementation of the automatic locking cockpit doors, Hibashi managed to re-enter the cockpit. It was only 11 seconds after the dive began. What's happening? What's happening? Hibashi shouted as he clambered back into his seat. I rely on God, Boutatti whispered. Flight 990 accelerated faster and faster, exceeding its maximum operating speed and triggering the master caution alarm. I rely on God, said Boutatti. What's happening? Captain Hibashi asked again. What's happening, Gamil? What's happening? But Boutatti did not respond. Hibashi then noticed that the engines were at idle. What is this? Did you shut the engines? Hibashi shouted. At the same time, he started pulling back on his control column to pull the plane out of the dive, which had increased to a dizzying descent rate of 39,000 feet per minute. Slowly but surely, Hibashi started to overpower Boutatti, who was still trying to push the nose down. But when Hibashi tried to increase engine power, he found that Boutatti had switched the fuel flow switch to the cutoff position, causing both engines to flame out. Get away in the engines, Hibashi said, his grammar failing him. Shut the engines! It's shut, said Boutatti, several times. Hibashi shouted, pull with me, as he tried to get Boutatti to help him out of the dive. But they still continued to work against each other, causing the left and right elevators to move in opposite directions. A few seconds later, the engines shut off completely, and the plane lost all electrical power. The black box stopped recording, and the plane's transponder disappeared off controllers' radar screens. What happened inside the cockpit of Flight 990 from this point onward will never be known. However, several facilities in the northeastern United States continued to track the 767 on primary radar for 2 minutes after the loss of power. The plane appeared to have bottomed out an altitude of about 16,000 feet, climbing back to 2,500 feet, then entered a second dive, plunging again towards the sea at a rate of 20,000 feet per minute. This time, it did not recover. Stressed beyond its limits, the airframe began to disintegrate. The left engine ripped away from the wing, and control surfaces tore from their mountings. Finally, at 1:52 a.m., EgyptAir Flight 990 slammed its nose into the Atlantic Ocean, 96 kilometers south of Nantucket Island, instantly killing all 217 people on board. Within minutes of the crash, a search was being called. The aircraft crashed in international waters, so the Egyptian government had the right to initiate its own search and rescue and investigation. Because the government did not have the resources to salvage the aircraft, the Egyptian government requested that the United States lead the investigation. The Egyptian government signed a letter formally ceding the responsibility of investigating the accident to the United States. Search and rescue operations were launched within minutes of the lost radar contact, with the bulk of the operation being conducted by the United States Coast Guard. At 3 a.m. Eastern Time, an HU-25 Falcon jet took off from Air Station Cape Cod, becoming the first rescue party to reach the last known position of the plane. All U.S. Coast Guard cutters in the area were immediately diverted to search for the aircraft, and an urgent marine information broadcast was issued, requesting mariners in the area to keep a lookout for the downed aircraft. At sunrise, the United States Merchant Marine Academy training vessel found an oil sheen and some pieces of debris. Rescue efforts continued by air and by sea, with a group of U.S. Coast Guard cutters covering 10,000 square miles on October 31st, with the hope of locating survivors. But no bodies were recovered from the debris field. The victims were so badly injured by the crash that only pieces and body parts remained. Eventually, most passengers were identified by DNA from what was left of the victims. The investigation into the crash became like any other. The plane went down in international waters, legally giving Egypt jurisdiction over the case. But because the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board was far more experienced, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak asked the U.S. to take over the investigation. Then, 9 days after the crash, everything changed. An underwater search had turned up both of the plane's black box flight recorders, which were carefully raised from the seatbed and sent to Washington, D.C. for analysis. In a room at the NTSB headquarters, American and Egyptian investigators listened to the cockpit voice recording for the first time. What they heard was horrifying. There was no discussion of an emergency, no sign of any mechanical failure, only the sounds of the wind, the alarms, and Boutatti quietly whispering, "I rely on God," over and over again, which just sounds eerie. It was all but certain that Boutatti had crashed the plane on purpose. An EgyptAir representative who listened to the recording reportedly left the room horrified. It was not long before the second-hand descriptions of the content of the CVR leaked to the press. News reports falsely claimed that Boutadi had said, "I have made my decision. I place my faith in the hands of God," and that he had recited a Muslim prayer as the plane went down. Overnight, EgyptAir Flight 990 went from a plane crash to a major international incident. Egypt quickly accused the US media of smear campaigns, bringing in experts who noted that the correct translation of Boutadi's refrain was "I rely on God." In fact, Egyptian authorities not only rejected the poor translation, but rejected the possibility that Boutadi had intentionally crashed the plane. What NTSB investigators hoped would be a short inquiry suddenly got a lot longer. Egyptian investigators and Egyptian media put forward one alternative hypothesis after another. Some of them were completely absurd. Early on, for example, Egyptian authorities asked the NTSB to state that the plane had been brought down by a bomb in the forward laboratory. Obviously, they refused. The head of the NTSB wanted to publish the report with the conclusion that Boutadi crashed the plane, but it was decided that it would put a strain on US and Egyptian relations. The NTSB, therefore, had no choice but to look into anything the Egyptians came up with. For example, Egyptian investigators put forward a possible scenario involving an elevator failure. Each elevator is moved by 3 actuators, and if 2 of these actuators were to fail on the same side, not unlike that experienced by the Flight 990. What's more, 2 rivets in the actuator bell crank assembly were found to be seared, possibly before the crash. But it quickly became clear that that theory didn't hold water. First, no connection could be found between the seared rivets and the potential actuator jam. Second, such a jam should be easily recoverable using the non-failed elevator by simply pulling back on the control column. And third, such a failure would produce a downward pitch steeper than the one that actually occurred. Nevertheless, the FAA took the seared rivets seriously, and an inspection turned up similar failures over the 100 Boeing 767 and 757s. All were subsequently fixed. Over and over, the NTSB shot down the Egyptians' mechanical failure scenarios using math and similar testing. Nor could any physical evidence be found in the wreckage to indicate that any of these failures took place. The Egyptian press accused the US government of a cover-up, that in reality, the plane was faulty, and the allegation that Boutadi committed suicide was meant to absolve Boeing of responsibility. Eventually, there was nothing left for the NTSB to even pretend to investigate. In 2002, it published its long-awaited report, concluding that the probable cause of the crash was the control inputs of the first relief officer. For diplomatic reasons, the report did not use the words suicide, deliberate, or intentional. Meanwhile, the FBI was searching for a motive. On paper, there's nothing to suggest Camille al-Boutadi could have been suicidal. He had a family, he had a plan for retirement, and earlier that day, he had bought a car tire to bring back to his son. They had even discussed it on the phone before the flight. Nor was he a religious fundamentalist. But by February 2000, new allegations began to emerge. Interviews with the staff at the hotel Boutadi usually stayed at while he was in New York revealed that he had repeatedly been reprimanded for sexually harassing female employees and guests, including unwanted solicitations, stalking, and indecent exposure. Allegedly, EgyptAir's chief pilot, Hadam Rushdie, who died on Flight 990, had scolded Boutadi for his behavior just before the flight. Then the search for a motive got a major jolt when Air Egypt pilot Hamdi Hanafi Taha defected to the United Kingdom, claiming he had new information on the Flight 990. He told the FBI that just before the flight, Hadam Rushdie had told Boutadi that because of his sexual impropriety, his privilege of flying to the United States would be revoked. Not only was this a blow to Boutadi's pride, it represented a financial blow as well, because transatlantic flights paid more than regular flights. Boutadi's pride was apparently already fragile. He had reached a high rank in the Egyptian Air Force and had personally trained many EgyptAir's best pilots. But because he joined the airline in his 40s and his English skills were poor, he was never able to rise above the rank of first officer. And many of the pilots he trained ended up outranking him. To hide the fact that he wasn't a captain, he always wore a sweater that covered up the number of bars on his uniform, and he never wore his hat. So he was in a delusion. Could the alleged revocation of his right to fly in the United States be enough to have pushed him over the edge? Or could he have suffered a psychotic break and crashed the plane to get revenge against Hatem Rushdie? Taha seemed to think so. He also told the FBI that immediately after the crash, Air Egypt pilots had been called to a meeting where they were given the facts, and only the facts. According to Taha, everyone left that meeting knowing that Boutadi had crashed that plane on purpose. The theories being put forward by the Egyptian authorities were nothing but a facade. In the end, Taha's credibility is questionable, as he did not personally witness the alleged conversation between Rushdie and Boutadi. But according to famed aviation writer William Langewiesche, who spent months researching and investigating into the Flight 990, he was right about the facade being put up by the Egyptian authorities. Langewiesche found that when he asked Egyptian investigators about the crash, they stonewalled him. He interpreted this to mean that they did not actually believe a mechanical failure caused the crash, because if they did, they would have tried to show him the evidence. He then went on to state, "It seems to me that they knew very well that their man Boutadi had done this. They're pursuing a political agenda that was driven by the need to answer to their higher-ups in a very pyramidal, autocratic political structure. The word had been passed down from on high, probably from Marabak himself, that there was no way that Boutadi, the co-pilot, could have done this. For the accident investigators in Egypt, the game then became not pursuing the truth, but backing the official line. However, the Egyptian public did genuinely believe that Boutadi had been framed. In fact, everyday Egyptians seemed to take the allegations personally, calling the entire affair a colonialist effort to shift the blame onto a third world country and its third world pilots. The popular belief, spread by Boutadi's relatives, was that the entire basis for the suicide theory was one mistranslated line from the Cockpit voice recorder, but this represented a willful disregard for the evidence. Much of it came down to the commonly held belief that Muslims do not commit suicide. Defenders of Boutadi also note that it would be very strange to repeat the phrase, I rely on God, before crashing the plane. I rely on God is a common Egyptian saying, used to request God's help before some everyday task. Perhaps, they argue, he was asking for God's help in saving the plane. He would have been a lot better off helping himself, but he apparently never attempted to do so. In a rare move, the NTSB did not make any safety recommendations as a result of the crash. The attitude was, how could there be a regulatory solution to a single pilot who lost his mind? As much as the NTSB strives to squeeze every possible lesson from every crash, from this one, it found little to learn. I think they could have learned to give pilots more mental health screenings, or at the very least, don't let them fly anymore after telling them that they were going to be terminated. However, as a precaution, airlines in the US now require 2 people in the cockpit at all times, so at least something came out of this tragedy. I personally think it was revenge that motivated Boutadi. Boutadi was a man facing ruin in the light of a series of allegations of sexual misconduct, including exposing himself to teenage girls, propositioning hotel maids, and stalking female hotel guests. His boss told him that this would be his last flight, and Boutadi's attitude was that it would be his boss's last flight as well, since his boss was also aboard the airplane. Revenge just makes sense. Boutadi's ego was fragile and hurt by this discipline, so he had to get revenge. It seemed like Boutadi was very prideful and had delusions that he was in charge, and by firing him, his delusions that he was a captain would be destroyed. This is just speculation, but I think he did it to get revenge on his boss. But we may never know exactly why Gamil al-Boutadi deliberately dived EgyptAir Flight 990 into the sea, taking 216 people with him. As I just noted, it could have been an act of revenge against his boss, or it could have been some other reason, only known to himself, but the fact that he did it intentionally is indisputable. The accident sequence began while he was alone in the cockpit, after making an unusual request to begin his duty early. There was no apparent reason for him to disengage the autopilot. There was no apparent reason for him to push the nose down and hold it there. And when Captain Habashi returned to his seat, Boutadi made no attempt to inform him of a problem. And when Habashi requested that he pull up, he kept pulling down. The last 2 minutes of Flight 990 hold secrets that will forever haunt us. What final words did Habashi say as he realized that his co-pilot had killed them all? What did those 217 people feel as the tremendous G-forces of that final dive ripped the airplane apart? And as the sea rose up beneath them, did Gamil al-Boutadi regret what he had done? I doubt he did in the end. Well, that was truly a grotesque tale. This was one incident where a selfish and delusional pilot got his revenge, and the poor passengers' implied trust that the pilot would get them to their destination safely was shattered. We just don't realize what goes on in the minds of those who we trust with our lives. What I don't get is that there are so many people in Egypt who didn't think that the first officer would have been so evil as to crash a plane with all those innocent people. The first officer's actions were cold and calculated, and he was truly an evil person. May the souls of those who were on board rest in peace. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe, like, and share if you would also like to keep exploring our grotesque curiosity. We will meet again in the darkness of the night.